Video contains violent content, details that are not suitable for common perception. Please consider before watching. Chapter 121, Demon Sword. 1. If you agree to join me, I will give you one of the legendary demon swords, the Evil Commandment Sword. 1. Murmur, murmur. At the Shadow Master's words, the crowd stirred. The Evil Commandment Sword? Yes. He said the demon sword, Evil Commandment Sword. That was in the Shadow Master's possession? Oh my. It wasn't just the warriors wearing the red belts of Corpse Blood Valley who were astonished like this. Even the executives who had their backs turned looked at the Shadow Master with surprised eyes. Even the Bright Blade King Sun Yun, who was confident no matter what proposal the Shadow Master made, had his eyes wavering at the mention of the Evil Commandment Sword. At this, Mok Jung-un swept his eyes around and wondered. He had only mentioned a single sword, so why were they reacting like this? The Evil Commandment Sword. Then Chong Ryong's voice reached Mok Jung-un's ears. She also seemed quite surprised as her voice was filled with excitement. Curious about her reaction, Mok Jung-un tried sending a silent message, focusing on the wooden puppet at his chest. Do you know what the Evil Commandment Sword is? It was a doubtful silent message. But she replied in a surprised voice. How in the world did you do that? It's called a silent message. I thought it might work, and it seems you can hear it. Even though she was sealed in the wooden puppet, it seemed possible because this was also a method of transmitting sound. When did you learn this? The Summoning Sound Valley Master over there taught me. I see you learned it from that flirtatious wench who uses sound techniques. Yes. I think I've heard of it. There are some among the Shaolin monks who know how to use this method. Anyway, why are you and everyone else so surprised? At Mok Jung-un's question, Chong Ryong clicked her tongue. However, since Mok Jung-un barely knew anything about the martial world, it was right to explain it to him. Among the blacksmiths who make weapons, there are those who are called master craftsmen. The weapons made by them gain fame and are called famous swords or unrivaled weapons. I think I've heard of them. Like the Heaven-Reliant Sword, Ganjiang or Moyi 3. Right? Yeah. That's it. What? Ganjiang and Moyi. Ganjiang and Moyi? Yes. Those are called famous swords, but they are also known as demon swords. I didn't know that. Mok Jung-un learned writing and scholarship through his grandfather. In his studies he heard various ancient tales and only knew that Ganjiang and Moyi were made by heating a furnace with Moye's hair and nails at the request of King Helu of Wu. Do you know who the master of Ganjiang and Moyi was? Master? Could it be Yes. The Evil Commandment Sword was made by their master, the great craftsman Yezi. At those words, Mok Jung-un's eyes glinted with interest. That was because if it was Yezi, he was known as the greatest craftsman of his time, and even to this day. The great craftsman Yezi, 4. Even now, the swords that could be called the best were made during the spring and autumn period, and half of those famous swords were made by the great craftsman Yezi of the Yu Kingdom. The legendary famous swords such as Great Destroyer, Juk 5, Black Zhanlu 6, Purity Chuanjuan 7, Victory over Evil Xingxia 8, Fishbelly Yuzhong, Dragon Gulf Longyuanwen, Great Riverbank 11, and Artisanal Display, Gongbu 12 were all born from his hands. These were famous swords that anyone with a little education would know, as there were many well-known anecdotes and tales about them. That's interesting. Yezi. But I don't think I've heard of the Evil Commandment Sword before. That's to be expected. Those were the swords Yezi wanted to keep hidden. He wanted to keep them hidden? Literally. There was a strange legend circulating among craftsmen a long time ago. What strange legend? The legend that if you make a sword using the flesh and blood of a living human as an offering, the greatest famous sword will be born. Making a sword with a living human? For ordinary people, it would be a story that not only gave them goosebumps but also made them express shock. However, at those words, the corners of Mok Jung-un's mouth curved up. That's cool. What? No, it's nothing. So, is that Evil Commandment Sword made by offering a living human? That's not known for certain. In the historical records of ancient times, there is a record that Yezi succeeded in melting the Guanya black iron, which was said to be unmeltable, and made a few unknown demon swords. At her words, Mok Jung-un asked in wonder. You're calling it a demon sword, not a famous sword. There's a reason it's called that. As she was about to answer, the Bright Blade King Sun Yun stepped forward and said, The Evil Commandment Sword? How is it that you, Sir Shadow Master, have it? At his question, the Shadow Master covered his mouth and replied, "Oh ho ho, somehow I was fortunate enough to acquire it not long ago. You see, I have a personal hobby of collecting famous weapons." Collecting? Yes. Didn't I give your eldest disciple, Grand Elder Wu Horang, the famous fierce tiger blade that I had in my possession? At those words, the Bright Blade King Sun Yun recalled an event from 6 years ago. As a gift for his eldest disciple Wu Horang becoming a Grand Elder, the Shadow Master had given him the famous blade Fierce Tiger Blade, Hogol, 13. The Fierce Tiger Blade was a famous blade made by Mu Hate, who was known as the most talented craftsman of his time, possessing a sharpness that could cut through even giant rocks with a single stroke. It was a blade that suited Wu Horang perfectly. I'm still grateful for that. But what you're talking about now is a demon sword. Isn't it literally a cursed sword? Cursed? What does that mean? As he wondered, the Shadow Master shrugged his shoulders and said it was fine. It's just a sword that hasn't found its owner. To the chosen owner, it's an endless famous sword. Isn't there a clear example of that? Like the renowned cleaving sword, 14, of Wei Taqian, the Vice Alliance leader of the Righteous Alliance. At those words, the crowd stirred once again. Wei Taqian, the Vice Alliance leader of the Righteous Alliance. He was one of the 8 stars of the 6 heavens and 8 stars and was known as one of the top 5 swordsmen in the current martial world. However, the reason they were surprised wasn't because of this peerless master named Wei Taqian. Sun Yun frowned and said, "Are you saying that without knowing how the previous owners of that renowned cleaving sword all died of illness within half a year?" That's right. The renowned cleaving sword, another demon sword known to have been made by the great craftsman O Yezi. Because of that sword, countless swordsmen engaged in bloody conflicts, and there were several instances where the owner changed. However, the owners who possessed this sword all died of illness within half a year without exception. That's too dangerous. But hasn't Wei Taqian been fine for 15 years? Everyone died. However, there was a single exception. Wei Taqian, the Vice Alliance leader of the Righteous Alliance, one of the 8 stars, known as the Sword of Satisfaction 15. He is a peerless master who has surpassed the wall. He's different from the previous owners. With those words, Sun Yun looked at Mok Jiangun. No matter how outstanding his talent was, he still considered him an unpolished gem. Giving a demon sword to such an unpolished gem was a dangerous act. Demon swords aren't called demon swords for nothing. If you really want to entice this child, it would be better to replace it with another collected item. All right. What? In an instant at Mok Jiangun's words, Sun Yun furrowed his brows. What did this guy just say? Did he not properly hear why he said that demon sword was dangerous? As he was thinking that, Mok Jiangun said, "If I go with the Shadow Master, you're saying you'll give me that sword called the Evil Commandment Sword, right? You. Could this guy possibly be coveting it just because it was made by the great craftsman O Yezi?" At this, the Bright Blade King Sun Yun dissuaded him with a somewhat heavy expression. "Listen, child. That's not a sword you should covet yet." "It's not a sword I should covet?" At this question, Sun Yun clicked his tongue and said, "It's not to belittle you. As I said earlier, a demon sword is literally a demon sword. You seem to be taking my words lightly because you're young and have a strong desire, but it's not a sword to approach with idle greed or curiosity." This was a sincere warning from Sun Yun. Although O Yezi's demon swords gained attention due to Wei Taqian, just 15 years ago, 4 owners lost their lives because of it. Considering the case of the renowned cleaving sword, Sun Yun believed the Evil Commandment Sword would be no different. "What do you think?" Mok Jiangun sent a silent message to Chong Ryong. Then she replied, "His words aren't unreasonable." "What do you mean by that?" "Even before I died, the martial world was engulfed in a storm of blood because of the great craftsman O Yezi's demon swords. It seems there's more than one." "Yes. It's not known exactly how many there are, but a few are known. Renowned cleaving sword, fear-killing sword, 16. Evil commandment sword." Although she was dead, the memories were still vivid. 3 swords were discovered in a collapsed royal tomb by a local official and a wealthy merchant. Those 3 swords brought a storm of blood to the martial world at that time. Recalling this, she soon said, "To be honest, if it were before I died, I would have definitely told you not to covet that demon sword. What about now? If there is a vengeful spirit in the demon sword, it could also become a source of power for you. This was Chong Ryong's honest opinion. Mok Jae-eun had already absorbed Chong Ryong's energy, the goo poison, and even the spiritual beast level Imi Mangniang, who were weakened due to being sealed, making it his own power. Considering this, no matter how notorious the demon sword was, she didn't think there would be something so tremendously dangerous to that extent. But you're not choosing the Shadow Master because of the demon sword, are you? At Chong Ryong's question, Mok Jae-eun smiled faintly. Of course, that wasn't the reason. Although he was interested in the so-called demon sword, it wasn't enough to change his planned objective. However, that's not the reason, but it turned out to be a coincidence. You mortal. She had been continuously advising him to choose one of the two five kings. It was because being close to someone in a high position would allow him to get closer to the core. But Mok Jae-eun's thoughts were different. The Shadow Clan plays the role of shadows, handling information and intelligence, right? Mortal. I know you have a lot of interest in things like information, but once you reach a high position, such things will naturally. While she was speaking, the Shadow Master opened his mouth again. Oh ho ho. The Bright Blade King's words also have a point. Indeed, it's true that demon swords are somewhat dangerous, but since it's also a famous sword made by the great craftsman Oyezi, I offered it to win that child's favor. At those words, the Bright Blade King Sun Yun softly said, "You've thought well." He thought the Shadow Master had taken a step back. However, but it's a bit awkward to withdraw what I've said in front of everyone watching, isn't it? What? Then how about this? What if we let that child hold the evil commandment sword once and see if he has the potential to become its owner? At the Shadow Master's words, the Bright Blade King, Sun Yun's expression twisted. He had said that demon swords were dangerous and shouldn't be given, but now he was going further and suggesting to let him hold it, as if he was taking his words lightly. Shadow Master, coincidentally, I happened to bring the sword with me. Brought the sword? What do you mean by that? Snap. The Shadow Master snapped his fingers. Then the martial artists, who seemed to be from the Shadow Clan, dressed in black and waiting behind the platform, ran off somewhere. Soon after, they carefully brought back a long wooden box, carried by two people on a wooden plank. Everyone's attention was focused on the wooden box, which appeared to be the exact length of a sword. Why in the world did you bring this? The Bright Blade King Sun Yun asked in an incomprehensible tone. It was already a dangerous sword. He couldn't understand why it was brought all the way to Corpse Blood Valley. At that question, the Shadow Master smiled slightly, clasped his hands together, bowed his waist and replied, "I apologize, but I cannot answer that question, so please understand." Understand? Are you avoiding my question now? The Bright Blade King Sun Yun's voice was filled with anger. His energy was surging as if he was ready to have a showdown at any moment. No choice, I guess. At this, the Shadow Master approached Sun Yun and whispered something in his ear. Then Sun Yun's eyes, which had been filled with anger, narrowed. Sun Yun also said something softly. In that way, the whispered conversation between the two went back and forth a few times. Then the Shadow Master said in an audible voice, "What do you think?" At those words, Sun Yun remained silent for a moment before replying, "If it becomes a problem, I will have it confiscated at any time." That's perfectly reasonable. What in the world did the Shadow Master say that made the Bright Blade King Sun Yun suddenly change his attitude? As he was wondering, the Shadow Master turned his head to Mok Jae-eun and said, "Oh ho ho, that took a bit long. Anyway, since the Bright Blade King also gave his advice, it seems difficult to simply give you this sword, so would you like to hold it once?" With those words, the Shadow Master nodded to his subordinates. Then a warrior opened the tightly closed lid of the wooden box. The executives, who were already curious about the evil commandment sword, got up from their seats, turned their bodies and looked at it. However, inside the open wooden box there was another wooden box. And on the outside of that wooden box, numerous talismans were stuck all over. Seeing this, Mok Jae-eun's eyes sparkled. It might not be visible to the eyes of others, but to Mok Jae-eun's eyes an ominous demonic energy was leaking out through the gaps where the talismans were attached. It really seems to be a demon sword. If it weren't for the talismans, the energy would have been even more exposed on the surface. The Shadow Master pointed to this wooden box with his hand and said, "Take it out and hold it yourself. If the sword chooses you, I will give you that instead of a substitute. Of course, on the premise that you come to the Shadow Clan." At his words, Mok Jaeong-un walked forward. And he placed his hand on the wooden box which was covered in talismans. The bright Blade King Sun Yun's eyes watching this turned peculiar. He recalled what the Shadow Master had said just before. It's difficult to say why I brought it, but let me tell you something interesting. Something interesting. I also found out only after obtaining this, but that sword makes human desires surface. It makes desires surface? What do you mean by that? Literally. It makes you unable to control your own desires. How could you bring such a dangerous thing? Aren't you curious? What the true desire of that child who defected to our sect is? Mok Jaeong-un's true desire. Would the evil commandment sword really reveal that desire as the Shadow Master said? Chapter 122, Demon Sword 2. Mok Jaeong-un's hand was reaching towards the wooden box covered in talismans. That sword makes human desires surface. It makes desires surface? What do you mean by that? Literally. It makes you unable to control your own desires. Aren't you curious? What the true desire of that child who defected to our sect is? Mok Jaeong-un's true desire. Since desire is a deep wish, it was akin to one's actual inner thoughts. Even the bright Blade King Sun Yun was curious about it. Although he had declared his defection, Sun Yun didn't really believe it was genuine. There was a high probability that he did it to avoid the current situation. Then what was that fellow's true objective? Creak. The lid of the wooden box covered in talismans opened under Mok Jaeong-un's hand. As the lid opened, the evil commandment sword wrapped in a leather scabbard was revealed. The moment he tried to take a closer look, Sun Yun felt goosebumps on his arm from something strange that stimulated his five senses. Flinch. What is this? It's a feeling that can't be explained. This was felt not through spirit perception, but it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it stimulated the five senses, no, the sixth sense. That subtle ominousness one might feel when walking alone on a dark night path. It was as if it had been maximized. Is this what they call a demon sword? It's clearly different from those called famous swords or famous blades. Those didn't have this unpleasant feeling from the beginning, but this stimulated the senses even while wrapped in leather. The Shadow Master, who had been observing Mok Jaeong-un's reaction more closely than the contents inside, had a glint of interest in his eyes. He had already seen it. That's why he knew that most people would be engulfed in a strange sensation the moment they saw that sword for the first time. However, Mok Jaeong-un's reaction was different from what he expected. Mok Jaeong-un was unaffected. Rather, he was looking at the sword in the scabbard with interest. An indescribably strange ominousness was emanating from that demon sword, yet he showed such a reaction, so he truly wasn't ordinary. How is it? Chong Ryong asked Mok Jaeong-un. Being sealed in a wooden puppet, it was difficult for her to discern the external energy. At her question, Mok Jaeong-un's eyes narrowed. It's different. Different? The energy Mok Jaeong-un was looking at was similar to the demonic energy of the two demonic beauties, but also resembled the ominous spiritual energy of vengeful spirits. It was a complex energy that he had never felt before. At this, Mok Jaeong-un's lips curled up as if he found it interesting. I think I'll know if I touch it directly. The ominous energy emanating from the sword was tempting him. It was telling him to remove the scabbard and grasp its hilt. If it wants, I should oblige, right? Mok Jaeong-un grasped the scabbard and lifted the evil commandment sword. And with his right hand he gripped the hilt. At the same time, shing, he freed the sword from the leather scabbard. Ooh, is that the evil commandment sword? It's indeed a precious sword. Exclamations poured out from here and there. With a small groove carved near the center of the hilt and a unique pattern drawn on the blade, it was as if looking at a work of art. Half of the blade was black and the other half was white, adding to the antique and beautiful atmosphere. Gulp. Sun Yun, who got to see it up close, unknowingly swallowed his saliva. The moment he saw the sword, greed arose from deep within his heart without him realizing it. Even though he wasn't a swordsman. However, in that instant Sun Yun drew up his true energy and gathered his senses. Demon sword. It's definitely a demon sword. For someone like him who had no interest in swords to feel greed the moment he saw a sword, it was truly a strange occurrence. If one were to be bewitched by it, a great disaster would unfold. Sun Yun looked around. As expected, the concerns he had came to fruition. Some of the warriors of Corpse Blood Valley and those brought by the executives were walking over with blank eyes as if they were possessed by something. Judging this situation to be dangerous, Sun Yun infused his true energy and let out a shout. Roar! 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 At the same time, Sun Yun's shout spread out in all directions like an echo. This intense shout infused with true energy was none other than the lion's roar. As Sun Yun's lion's roar resonated throughout the entire plaza, those who had been momentarily possessed by desire as if bewitched by something all covered their ears at once. Ugh! By my ears! They weren't the only ones who regained their senses after being shaken by the tremendous shout. Huh! What is this? The two grand elders also unknowingly half rose from their chairs for a moment, then gathered their senses with perplexed expressions while circulating their energy. It was a moment when they directly experienced the power of the demon sword they had only heard about. Still, it ended at this level because they didn't personally hold it. Mok Jaeongun? Sun Yun looked at Mok Jaeongun with worried eyes. However, contrary to his concerns, Mok Jaeongun was looking at the sword with indifferent eyes. What's this? There wasn't a hint of greed in those eyes. The Shadow Master also found this strange. What is it? He had already seen his subordinates being possessed by desire several times after grasping that sword. Didn't he himself also reveal the desires he had hidden the moment he grasped it? Shadow Master, how could you? Did I say such a thing? He still couldn't forget the expression his dead subordinate had made. It was truly a regrettable incident. That demon sword was a genuinely dangerous sword. The Shadow Master had obtained what he had longed for, but he decided to give up his desire to collect it. It was an uncontrollable demon. There's no way he doesn't have desires. Even he, who prided himself on having a strong willpower, had revealed the desires he had hidden because of that demon. However, no matter how outstanding Mok Jaeongun's talent was, there was no way a greenhorn like him could endure the power of that demon. Right at that moment, thud, Mok Jaeongun's eyes closed and his head tilted back. Seeing this, the Shadow Master muttered with gleaming eyes. As expected. There was no way he wouldn't be captivated by the demon sword. Mortal? Chong Ryong called out to Mok Jaeongun, who had suddenly lost consciousness. She didn't know what was happening. He had said it was a unique energy and that he would try absorbing it through the ritual of binding, but he suddenly lost consciousness. Just what was going on? Zhang ran. After running for a while and reaching the top of the mountain, Zhang frowned. He saw black smoke there. The place where the smoke was rising from was where the house was located. Seeing this, Zhang threw the water jug and ran like crazy towards that place. When he arrived there, crackle crackle, the scorching heat was felt. The house was burning fiercely. Zhang's face stiffened terribly. Zhang, who was hurriedly looking around, ran to the back of the burning house. There was a small vegetable garden in the backyard. Normally, his grandfather would wake up early in the morning and pick medicinal herbs in the vegetable garden. Please. Zhang, who ran to the vegetable garden, stopped in his tracks. Through his eyes that had widened as if they would burst, he saw something stained with blood. Things that should be inside the body were scattered in the vegetable garden. Nash. Zhang gritted his teeth, and he followed the trail of blood and fragments. Looking down the hill, Zhang shouted, "Grandfather!" His grandfather was there. The sight of his grandfather with only the upper body remaining, the lower part torn away, was indescribably horrible. Zhang's face, looking at this, was distorted like a demon along with sadness. The killing intent that had been pressing deep in his chest filled his mind. No. At that moment, everything stopped. The killing intent from revenge. This isn't your fundamental desire. The entity examining the memories shook its head. Revenge could also become a desire, but this wasn't the desire that this person fundamentally possessed. Show me your true desire. He wanted to see the desire closest to the purest origin. That desire was the very reason for its existence. You're truly peculiar. Who blocked the origin of your desire? It dug deep into the depths of the mind and discovered a huge wall filling all sides. The moment it saw this wall, it didn't hide its bewilderment. Strong willpower was sometimes projected in this way as a wall. However, this didn't seem to be created by the will of Mok Jaeongun, no, the one called Zhang, but rather planted by someone. To erect a wall of lamentation in another person's mind. How truly strange. An artificially created wall. Here, a strong emotion beyond the sadness and vengeance seen earlier was felt. This was blocking the origin of this fellow named Zhang. However, once this seemingly impenetrable wall of lamentation was shattered, the origin of desire that had been accumulating would pour out. I will open this for you. The wall of lamentation that seemed like it would never open. However, it had the ability to open even this. There was no need to break the wall. If the nature of the wall was changed so that it would naturally flow out. Slither. The wall was meant to become a path. It was right at that moment. Whoosh. Something began to pour out from a part of the wall that had become a path. It was darkness. Deep darkness. It was difficult to even see it as a fragment of desire. What in the world is this? How could such deep darkness be lurking inside a human? It began to feel ecstasy upon seeing this. It thought it was close to the high-purity desire it had been searching for. It entrusted its spiritual body to the pouring darkness. If it absorbed this and became one, an individual of sword-human unity, made solely of the high-purity desire it had longed for would be born. Now let's become one. It tried to assimilate with this darkness. However, at that moment, it realized that this darkness wasn't simple. It wasn't high-purity darkness. This was turbidity itself, dizzying enough to make one lose their mind. This turbidity that seemed to destroy everything was... Swish. Mok Jiangun, who had his head tilted back, slowly raised it. The bright blade king Sun Yun carefully observed Mok Jiangun. It was clear that he was possessed by the demon sword, but what kind of desire he had would soon... Pitch-black eyes like black jade. They were like an endless abyss. What happened to his eyes? Is that the state of desires being expressed? Something was strange. At that moment, one of the Grand Elders, the Flame Demon Grand Elder Bo Hyukso, shouted at Mok Jiangun, "You bastard! Come to your senses." Judging by Mok Jiangun's condition, it seemed like he was definitely captivated by the demon sword. Thinking that he needed to be awakened immediately, Bo Hyukso hurriedly tried to separate the demon sword from Mok Jiangun's hand. Right at that moment, swish, Bo Hyukso grabbed his own neck. Then he widened his eyes and broke out in a cold sweat like someone under immense tension. Just what was he doing? Bo Hyukso's eyes were trembling like crazy. Seeing his appearance, the bright blade king Sun Yun wondered what was happening, and the moment he met Mok Jiangun's eyes. In an instant, it was as if time had passed quickly. The sky turned red and then darkened, and the ground all around was stained with sticky blood. It was definitely the same place. However, all the people around had their necks cut or various parts of their bodies torn off, screaming in agony. Every being breathing within this plaza was suffering a horrible death or agonizing in the face of it. What in the world? What was happening? As he was engrossed in questions and looking around, crackle crackle, the bodies of those who were dead or dying all began to burn at once. The red and crimson flames soon turned blue, gradually darkening from purple, and ultimately transformed into black flames. Crackle crackle crackle. These black flames quickly became a fire demon and tried to devour everything around. Surprised by this, the bright blade king Sun Yun tried to leap back to avoid it. However, I can't move. His body wouldn't move, as if someone was holding him. He couldn't understand what was going on. Crackle crackle crackle. The black flames that had devoured everything around had grown enormous and tried to swallow him. Although Sun Yun wasn't greatly afraid of death, it was so eerie that he unknowingly closed his eyes for a moment. In an instant, silence came and nothing could be heard. Then, swish. Soon the surroundings brightened and the bright blade king Sun Yun opened his closed eyes. However, no. The plaza that had been devoured and burned by black flames had somehow returned to normal, and the flame demon Grand Elder Bo Hyukso was seen drenched in cold sweat with heavy breathing. But that wasn't all. The Shadow Master also seemed shocked by something, looking around with surprised eyes. It was as if he had also seen something. While that was happening, clang clang clang, a strange resonance sound that hurt the ears spread from somewhere. This sound is... The source of it was none other than the demon sword, Evil Commandment Sword. The blade of the Evil Commandment Sword was trembling wildly on its own, and this resonance sound seemed to be coming from the groove carved in the middle. It was as if the sword was in agony. This can't be, this is chaos itself. It trembled in fear, swept away by the chaos-like darkness. It had tried to become one with this origin, but it felt like it would be devoured by it instead. While that was happening, whoosh. In an instant, the overflowing darkness was rewound as if time was going backward, and Mok Jaeun no Jong was sitting in front of the pierced wall of lamentation with his chin resting on his hand. Dash. Seeing his appearance, it trembled even more crazily. Fear, dread. These emotions were the byproducts of humans that it had never felt before. But just what was that? At this, Jong wiggled his index finger and clicked his tongue, saying, "Not yet." Snap. With those words, he lightly flicked his finger. Then, the will of that entity, no, the will of the evil commandment sword that had dug into his psyche, disappeared from this space as if it had been extinguished. Sizzle. Soon, Mok Jaeun's eyes, which had turned black like black jade, returned to normal. As if nothing had happened. Mok Jaeun, who had regained his senses, frowned and then looked around. However, starting from the Bright Blade King Sun Yun, to the Shadow Master and the other executives, they were all looking at him with serious expressions. Chapter 123, Demon Sword 3. A white-haired man with his entire body bound in iron chains. Having been imprisoned for a long time, his long beard was unkempt. Looking at his face in the flickering torchlight, he appeared to be in his mid-30s at most, but his hair and beard had turned white. Despite being in an uncomfortable position due to the iron chains, the white-haired man's expression showed no change. It was as if he had no expression at all. Flink. The man slowly raised his head and looked at the moonlight visible through the iron bars. Tomorrow his execution would be carried out. Would he then be able to understand the sensations of fear and dread? Those facing death all had expressions filled with agony. Would he end up like that too? Even at this moment facing death, he felt nothing. Why was he born like this? He didn't know. As he was pondering, a strong wind suddenly blew into the prison cell. Whoosh. Then the torch illuminating the cell went out. What? The drowsy jailer's voice was heard as he got up. But soon the sound of something collapsing on the floor followed. Thud. What is it? As he wondered, the sound of someone walking towards the cell filled with darkness was heard. It was the footsteps of one person. But when he looked ahead, he saw two figures in the darkness. Two people. Although his dungeon was sealed, they were right in front of him, yet he couldn't sense their presence at all. They must be truly skilled martial artists. As he was thinking that, a small voice was heard. Hui, the Thousand Heads Tower. The vicious man who beheaded 1,000 people and built a tower with their heads. Sufficient as material. Oh my. A sigh followed. Looking ahead, there was a monk with his hands behind his back, pointing at the cell, and an old man frowning and looking at him. In the moonlight, he could only tell that he was an old man, but this strange scent he smelled. The scent of charcoal and iron. A blacksmith. At the white-haired man's words, interest glinted in the old man's eyes. The old man stared at him intently and then spoke. Young man, why did you do such a thing? At the old man's question, the white-haired man, no, Seo Doi, replied with an expressionless gaze. I don't know. You don't know? Then you just did it. I just wanted to know. Wanted to know? I wanted to know what emotions were. Emotions? Yes. He had none of the emotions of joy, anger, sorrow, or happiness. From a young age, he didn't know what they were, so he wanted to know those emotions. That was what he had desired most in his life. I just wanted to know what they were. A strange desire, different from ordinary people. Why did this desire lead to such a twisted end? If that was the reason, there were many other ways. Why did you do that to so many people? He couldn't finish his words. The severed heads by his hand all had expressions of despair and pain. He stacked them like a work of art to build a tower. Because fear and dread were easier than joy or happiness. Easier. In the face of death, everyone shows those emotions. Oh my. At his words, the old man clicked his tongue. Then he soon said, This old man finds it hard to understand you, young man. But if you have such a twisted desire and obsession, you have the qualifications. Qualifications? Don't you want to leave something behind in this world before you die, young man? What do you mean by that? As he wondered, the old man curled his lips and said, How about offering yourself for the birth of an unprecedented sword? Mok Jaeun looked at the evil commandment sword he was holding. He couldn't understand what had just happened. He tried to absorb the unique energy of the evil commandment sword through the ritual of binding, but as it was absorbed into his body, it instantly dug into his mind. Then not long after he regained his senses. What is this? Various memories that weren't his own were mixed up in his mind. Whose memories were these? Memories rose up in fragments, jumbled together. The most intense memory was dark. Along with the sight of jumping into molten iron, it was a horrific memory of his entire body melting. It seemed to have happened while he was alive, but what was strange about this scene was that even while suffering like this, he felt ecstasy. Why did he feel joy while facing such a terrible death? It was a truly peculiar memory. These fragmented memories. The only time emotions were revealed was the moment he faced death. After that, strangely, it wasn't his own memories but the memories of numerous people that were mixed together. Among them, the Shadow Clan Master? The Shadow Clan Master's appearance was also seen. It was just a fleeting fragment, but that memory was truly fascinating. As he was thinking that, a resonant sound came from the sword he was holding. Mok Jaeongun looked at the evil commandment sword. Then the evil commandment sword trembled, making a resonant sound. It looked as if it was trembling in fear and submitting. Seeing this, the corner of Mok Jaeongun's mouth curled up. What in the world is this? The Shadow Clan Master looked around with surprised eyes. For a moment he saw a scene where thousands and tens of thousands of swords overturned everything around, and everyone here became a hive of swords and died. As he was perplexed, looking at those who died like that in an instant, the corpses were engulfed in black flames and everything turned to ashes. Startled, he came to his senses and realized it was all an illusion. As if he had seen a phantom. Drip. The human skin mask was drenched in sweat and the scene was so vivid. It felt like unstoppable destruction and chaos. Could one feel such heart-pounding fear from a mere illusion? Huff. Interest glinted in the Shadow Clan Master's eyes. Not only that, but all the executives around him had surprised faces as if they were possessed by something. Even the two great clan leaders, Bo Hyuk-so, grabbed their necks and let out rough breaths. Did they see a phantasm of their necks being cut? What is going on? The Shadow Clan Master felt bewildered by this strange situation. How could it be that not just one or two people but everyone around him was seeing such illusions? The Shadow Clan Master looked at Mok Jaeongun. His eyes trembled. Something was strange. He clearly saw Mok Jaeongun's eyes turn smooth like black jade just a moment ago. But now they were perfectly fine. Could it be that even that was an illusion? What is this? The one holding the demon sword, evil commandment sword, was Mok Jaeongun. But why did they see such illusions? He had let him hold the sword to find out what his desires were, but he didn't know why this happened. Could it be? As he was thinking that, Mok Jaeongun lightly swung the sword. The crisp sound of the sword cutting through the air made the Shadow Clan Master's eyes widen. It was the same for the Bright Blade King Sun Yun. He didn't know what that terrible illusion he had just seen was, but looking at Mok Jaeongun now, it seemed as if he wasn't affected by the demon sword at all. Moreover, that ominous energy that had been felt from the sword was no longer there. At this, Sun Yun asked, "Are you all right?" "Yes. I'm fine." "He's fine." At Mok Jaeongun's words, Sun Yun furrowed his brows. Was he really fine? Looking at the executives around him for a fleeting moment, they all had faces as if they had seen something illusory just like him. This couldn't have happened by chance. "Can you give the sword to this king for a moment?" "The sword?" "Yes." The reason Sun Yun asked this question was simple. He knew various tales related to demon swords and knew that those captivated by them would become obsessed with the demon sword. So if Mok Jaeongun was truly chosen as the master by the demon sword and was unaffected, he thought he would readily hand it over. At that moment, "Here it is." Mok Jaeongun readily placed his palm on the blade and politely brought the evil commandment sword with both hands. Seeing this, Sun Yun's eyes narrowed. Was this child really chosen by the evil commandment sword? "I'll know if I hold it myself." Sun Yun reached out his hand towards the hilt of the evil commandment sword in Mok Jaeongun's hands. Then the Shadow Clan Master hurriedly tried to stop him. "Your Excellency, the Bright Blade King." "It's fine. I'm just checking for a moment." At his words, the Shadow Clan Master looked at him with concerned eyes. Of course, he knew for what purpose he was trying to hold the sword, But even he who had reached the proficient stage transcendent realm had lost his reason for a moment because of the sword. Even if the Bright Blade King Sun Yun was a master who had reached the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm before the wall, it was just as dangerous. However, Sun Yun grabbed the hilt and lifted it up, but nothing happened. The sword, which had seemed so ominous just a moment ago, was now shining with the light of an ordinary famous sword, modestly showing off its elegance. What? Where did that ominous energy go? The resonant sound was also not heard. Sun Yun, who had been lightly swinging the sword, looked at the Shadow Clan master with puzzled eyes. The Shadow Clan master also looked at the evil commandment sword with eyes that couldn't understand the situation. The sword that had troubled him so much after coming into his possession had become so docile. He truly couldn't understand it. Did that child really receive the evil commandment sword's choice? Seeing that nothing happened even when Sun Yun held it for a long time, it seemed that the evil commandment sword, which had chosen its master, had transformed from a demon sword to a famous sword. It was truly amazing. The Shadow Clan master exclaimed, "Your Excellency, the Bright Blade King. It seems the true master of the evil commandment sword has been determined." In this way, Mok Jeongun obtained the legendary demon sword, Evil Commandment Sword, made by the great craftsman Oyezi. In the process, the nearby executives saw strange illusions, but even though they found it questionable, they all kept silent as if they had made a promise. In fact, it was awkward to suddenly mention that everyone saw an illusion of reaching destruction at this gathering, and even though it was just a fleeting moment, it was also a blow to their pride to say that they were captivated by the demon sword's demonic energy. However, thanks to this, they realized one thing. If there ever came a time when they had to confront that child named Mok Jeongun, they must make sure to separate the evil commandment sword from his hands. There was nothing unusual at the moment, but they couldn't shake off the thought that it was somehow dangerous. It's regrettable. The Bright Blade King Sun Yun couldn't hide his disappointment at losing Mok Jeongun. Not the Thunderbolt Fist King Won Byung-hak, but he chose that Shadow Clan master. He never expected such a result to unfold just because of a demon sword. It was disappointing, but there was nothing he could do. I'll have to be satisfied with this child. The disciple the Bright Blade King Sun Yun gained from the closing ceremony was none other than Mok Yucheon, another child of the Yun Mok Sword Manor brought as a hostage. Of course, this wasn't his choice. It was entirely Mok Yucheon's choice. I want to become stronger. Stronger than that guy. It was what Mok Yucheon had said in front of the executives. That guy was none other than Mok Jeongun. At his words, most of the executives turned away. It was because they considered Mok Yucheon, who had learned the strange corpse technique, a ticking time bomb. However, the Bright Blade King Sun Yun was the only one who didn't turn away. Rather, he said to Mok Yucheon, "You want to become stronger?" "Yes. If you follow this king's teachings well, I can make you so." At those words, Mok Yucheon chose him without hesitation. In fact, there was a hidden intention behind this. The Bright Blade King Sun Yun also didn't look favorably upon Mok Yucheon learning the strange evil techniques, but he accepted him as a disciple with Mok Jeongun in mind. In any case, there was no one else he had in mind as a disciple other than Mok Jeongun, so it could be said to be a card to prepare for contingencies. His value as a card to suppress that guy is sufficient. Mok Yucheon, who didn't know this, just wanted to become stronger. And he hadn't forgotten the request made by the Righteous Alliance's Silent Strides agent. His goal was to rise to the highest position possible here and regain his honor as a member of the Righteous faction. This child's talent is also not inferior to his, so I should have expectations. The Thunderbolt Fist King Won Byung-hak accepted Mu Zhengyak as his disciple. Originally, he had his eye on Yun Muong of the Esoteric Realm Gate, but in terms of talent, Yun Muong wasn't even half as good as Mu Zhengyak. Well, it should be fine. The Valley Master of Summoning Sound Heng Yeoriang accepted Mo Harang of the Demon Fire Hall as her disciple, as per her original goal. Inwardly, she had been conflicted about Mok Yucheon like the Bright Blade King Sun Yun, but to her, those from the Righteous faction were detestable whether they defected or not. Therefore, she decided to stick to her original purpose. Unfortunately, Yom Jie of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave lost his life, so the remaining disciple, Yun Muong of the Esoteric Realm Gate, failed to achieve his goal and was chosen as a disciple by the Grand Elder of the Crimson Blood Sect, Dae Soman. Only the Grand Elder of the Flame Demon Clan, Bo Hyukso, returned empty-handed without any achievement. In this way, the entrance exam of Corpse Blood Valley ended safely. The disciples who were selected by the executives who came as observers at the closing ceremony left with them to their residences. Mok Jaeongun also followed the Shadow Clan master, whom he had chosen himself. As they left Corpse Blood Valley, the Shadow Clan master said, "Oh ho ho, what a coincidence. I never thought I would accept a disciple who walks a completely different path from me." The Shadow Clan master's unique martial arts were Taoist techniques. On the other hand, the unique martial arts Mok Jaeongun mainly practiced could be said to be sword techniques. Therefore he was regretful about this aspect. At this, Mok Jaeongun smiled and said, "I don't particularly distinguish between swords and Tao, so if you give me teachings I can learn as much as possible." At those words, the Shadow Clan master spoke with delight. "Oh, really? Yes. It requires a bit of a price, is that all right?" "A bit of a price? What does that mean?" As Mok Jaeongun wondered, the Shadow Clan master covered his mouth with his hand and said coquettishly, "My unique martial arts have strong yin energy, so to learn them, you have to be castrated." Chapter 124, Shadow Clan 1. In a wide room lit by a single candle. There was a bed in the room surrounded by bamboo blinds. A shadow was sitting on the bed, revealed by the light shining through the bamboo blinds. The shadow gulped down something that looked like medicinal wine and placed it on the table beside the bed. Cough, cough. The shadow coughed. Someone was watching this scene with a somewhat bitter gaze. It was a white-haired man in his early 40s without a single beard. This man with snake-like eyes was Mong Xiaoqian, the second in command of the Heaven and Earth Society and the Vice Society leader. Society leader. How about summoning Crying Dr. Ho Ta? Crying Dr. Ho Ta, 1. Along with medicine immortal He Yang, whose whereabouts had become unknown long ago, he was called the greatest physician of the era. Unlike medicine immortal He Yang, who was said to have reached the highest realm in medicine, he had mastered both external and internal studies and was so skilled in medicine that he served as the royal physician in the imperial palace in his youth. If it's Crying Dr. Ho Ta, the society leaders. No. It's fine. A resolute voice came from behind the bamboo blinds. Hearing this, Mong Xiaoqian clicked his tongue inwardly. Why was he being so stubborn? Thanks to his profound internal energy he could endure, but if he couldn't release the energy within his body, his illness would eventually deepen. Cough, cough. More importantly, I heard the results of the Corpse Blood Valley entrance exam are out. That's right. The observers? Bright Blade King Sun Yun, Thunderbolt Fist King Won Byung Hak, Shadow Master, Summoning Sound Valley Leader Heng Yeoriang, Flame Demon Clan's Grand Elder Bo Hyukso, Crimson Blood Clan's Grand Elder Dae Somen. These 6. The assignments? Except for the Flame Demon Clan's Grand Elder Bo Hyukso, they each took 1 disciple. I see. Anything unusual? At that question, Vice Society leader Mong Xiaoqian sighed softly and opened his mouth. Do you remember sending the 2 hostage children of the Yun Mok Sword Manor to Corpse Blood Valley? Yun Mok Sword Manor? Ah yes. That happened. At the society leader's reaction, Mong Xiaoqian clicked his tongue inwardly. As expected, sending those 2 to Corpse Blood Valley seemed to have been a spur-of-the-moment whim. The society leader he had known was that kind of man. However, it seemed the time had come to face the backlash caused by that impulsive whim. The 2 hostage children. They died. No. They didn't die? Yes. They must have been tougher than I thought. Then how far did they pass? They passed the final gate. At that answer, the shadow behind the bamboo blinds flinched for a moment. Was he surprised by the unexpected result? Then a voice was heard. The hostages passed the final gate. An interesting turn of events. Could this simply be dismissed as an interesting event? Not just anyone, but those who were brought as hostages from the righteous faction passed the final gate of Corpse Blood Valley. If this spreads, there will be considerable controversy internally. In a way, this was no different from a humiliating result for the Heaven and Earth Society. This is not a matter to be laughed off. Not the disciples of our sect, but the hostages from the righteous faction jointly took first place. First place. Yes. The Mok brothers both tied for first place. At the Vice Society leader's words, The shadow behind the bamboo blinds finally threw his head back and burst into laughter. First place? Ah. First place, you say? It was quite different from him, who had taken the results seriously when he heard it. He was finding it amusing, as if it was someone else's business. Then, as if he had suffered internal injuries, he coughed violently and his breathing became rough. Puff puff, puff, ha. As expected, his internal injuries hadn't healed at all. Yet he was so stubborn. That monstrous fellow dying was unimaginable, but if he really died suddenly like this, there would be a huge rift internally. The Vice Society leader clicked his tongue inwardly and soon said, "Society leader, this could potentially lower morale within the sect and cause problems. Rather than this, the fact that he learned the sword technique of the moon." No. Swish. Suddenly the entire bamboo blind shook, and a sharp gaze was seen through the gaps. Gasp. The Vice Society leader's expression stiffened as he met that gaze. The Society leader's aura was pressing down on the entire room, making it difficult to even breathe. It was truly amazing that he could still exert this level of pressure despite lying in bed for a long time. He's still alive. It wasn't for nothing that he was called one of the 6 heavens at the pinnacle of the martial world. Even if he wasn't in his prime, it seemed there was no one in the fortress who could face the Society leader. Not even himself. Clench. Vice Society leader Mong Xiaoqian clenched his fist, steadied his breathing and calmed his trembling hand. Then the aura that had filled the room disappeared in an instant. Soon after, the Society leader opened his mouth. No. That's still far from enough. What is he talking about? Vice Society leader Mong Xiaoqian slightly furrowed his brows. It was difficult to understand the meaning of what the Society leader was saying now. What was far from enough? Just leave the hostages alone. Is he serious? If it becomes known that he sent them to Corpse Blood Valley and allowed them to become disciples of the Observers regardless of their background, there will be those who question it. Does he not care about that? However, he couldn't voice any further objections. I understand. In the Heaven and Earth Society, the Society leader's orders were absolute. More importantly, have you found it? The Society leader changed the subject. At his question, Vice Society leader Mong Xiaoqian shook his head and replied, "Not yet. However." And he quietly said something. He was about to leave the main building after coming out of the Society leader's residence. Someone called out to Vice Society leader Mong Xiaoqian. Vice Society leader. At this, Mong Xiaoqian's eyes narrowed. Just from the voice, he immediately recognized who had called him. However, the problem was that he hadn't detected this person's location or presence until he called him. Has he progressed again? He had heard that he came out of seclusion a few days ago. He had heard that there were results, but to think he had progressed to the point where even he had difficulty detecting his presence. It was truly amazing. Young Master Zhang. As he turned his head, a young man in his late 20s with curly hair and a bright appearance was standing there with a smirk on his face. He was Zhang Neng, the second disciple of the Society leader. Although he was considered to be on the lower end in terms of talent among the Society leader's 3 disciples, that was only within those 3. If compared to his peers, he boasted overwhelming talent. The Society leader's second disciple, Zhang Neng, said with a smirk that revealed his unique dimples, "Is the Society leader still obsessed with finding that?" At his question, the Vice Society leader smiled without a word. It was because the conversation with the Society leader should not be revealed to anyone. That was the case even if it was a disciple. At this, the second disciple Zhang Neng joked and said, "I don't understand why the Society leader is so obsessed with such religious things. It would be better to spend that time searching for crying Dr. Ho Ta, don't you think?" Mong Xiaoqian inwardly agreed with those words. However, who could stop the Society leader's stubbornness? He must have his reasons. The Society leader's second disciple, Zhang Neng, shook his head at the Vice Society leader Mong Xiaoqian's ambiguous answer. It was always like this. He was the Society leader's right-hand man and had the most influence after the Society leader, so he wanted to win him over somehow, but it was particularly difficult. If he tried to get close even a little, he would immediately distance himself. Fortunately, he hadn't taken anyone's side yet. But this is only for now. He would soon join him. Zhang Neng said with a raised corner of his mouth. "I obtained an interesting piece of information. but I'm not sure if you know about it. An interesting piece of information? Yes. I heard that the ones who passed the Corpse Blood Valley entrance exam as the top scorers were the hostages of the Yun Mok Sword Manor brought by the Bright Blade King. Is that true? At that question, Vice Society leader Mong Xiaoqian silently let out a soft sigh. As expected, the rumors were already spreading. The second disciple Jiang Nungike must have quickly acquired this information, as he had a considerable number of supporters under his command. If he knew this much, there was no need to hide it. That's right. Heh. Heh. Jiang Nungi suddenly bit his thumbnail and laughed, holding back his laughter. Seeing his behavior, worry arose in Mong Xiaoqian's eyes. Having watched the society leader's disciples since they were young, he knew each one's personality better than anyone. This doesn't look good. When Jiang Nungike became interested in something, the results were usually not very good. If it was something that couldn't be touched in the first place, it was fine, but the moment he thought he could touch it, he became full of malice. Young master, just in case, I'll say this. Vice Society leader. You don't think I'll do something to them just because they're from the righteous faction, do you? It's not that, but I'm just interested in the fact that even the righteous faction has those with such wickedness and talent. Now they will become the strength of our sect, not the righteous faction. That's perfect. I hope that strength will be of help to me as well. At his words, the Vice Society leader was deeply concerned. Jiang Nungi was someone who would try to obtain and achieve what he wanted in any way possible. Southeast outskirts of the Heaven and Earth Society's inner fortress. There the headquarters of the Shadow Clan, 3, was located. As he entered the Shadow Clan, Mok Jiangun's eyes glinted with interest. That was because dozens of hawks and pigeons were flying into one of the buildings, and on the other side, people carrying flags were running over and handing over something that looked like scrolls, which were quickly read by others and burned. They're doing their job properly. Chong Ryong's voice echoed in his mind. What are they doing? As you can see, they're managing the messenger birds and burning the letters that come to the Shadow Clan to maintain confidentiality. Oh ho! It was indeed fitting for an organization that dealt with information and secrets. While that was happening, the Shadow Master headed somewhere without stopping. It wasn't a place where messenger birds and confidential documents were exchanged, but where weapons and training grounds were located. Creak. The door opened, revealing an indoor training ground. It seemed to be a place with thick walls that would provide quite good soundproofing. As the Shadow Master gestured, the warriors who had followed bowed their heads in greeting and left, closing the door. Thus, only the two of them were left in the indoor training ground. What was the reason he brought him here? As he was thinking that, the Shadow Master spoke. Oh ho ho! This is my personal training ground. A space completely isolated from the outside without a single window. It seemed to be designed so that no one could interfere or observe. As he looked around, the Shadow Master said, "How is it? Do you feel like learning my unique martial arts?" At his words, Mok Jiangun furrowed his brows. The Shadow Master had told him to think about it until they reached the Shadow Clan. The Shadow Master's unique martial arts. Naturally, as the martial arts that made him an executive, it could be called a supreme technique. However, the problem was that in order to learn it, one had to be castrated. How about cutting it off cleanly this time? Chong Ryong laughed as if she found it amusing. Castration literally meant removing the testicles, which could be considered the center of a man's yang energy. Although Mok Jiangun didn't particularly have any desires or thoughts of prospering his descendants, it didn't mean he wanted to be castrated. Mok Jun politely clasped his hands together in a salute and said, "I apologize, but I don't think I can do that." "You don't think you can?" "Yes. Then you'll become a subordinate under my command, not my official disciple. Surely you can consider that much." "I can't become an official disciple? Isn't it obvious? How can you be called a disciple if you don't learn our sect's martial arts?" It was a reasonable argument. However, becoming a subordinate of the Shadow Master, not his disciple, was a different story. The authority itself would be limited, and he would be in a position to merely follow orders. At this, Mok Jiangun said, "Do I have to be castrated to learn the unique martial arts?" "Yes. Of course. If you don't cultivate the Ghost Yin technique, 4, you won't be able to circulate energy for the Flying Ghost Blade technique, 5, or the Ghost Shadow Claw technique, 6. And without that you won't be able to execute the moves." The Shadow Master's martial arts were based on strong Yin energy. If one couldn't grasp the energy circulation method of the ghosting technique, they wouldn't be able to fully exert the power of the moves. At his words, Mok Jung-un stroked his chin as if he was in a difficult position. Seeing this, the Shadow Master laughed with his mouth covered and said, "Oh ho ho, I'm not forcing you to be castrated. However, if you want to become my official disciple, it's a process you have to go through." Do I absolutely need Yin energy to learn martial arts? Yes. If it were martial arts that could be executed with Yang energy, our sect wouldn't have needed to be castrated for generations. The Shadow Master didn't choose to be castrated because he wanted to. It was simply a natural course to learn the sect's martial arts. However, because there was much to lose for this, he always gave the choice to those who would become his disciples. Of course, until now, no one had willingly chosen to be castrated. The Shadow Master had thought from the beginning that Mok Jung-un wouldn't be able to do it voluntarily either. At that moment, Mok Jung-un asked, "Isn't Yin energy the opposite concept of Yang energy?" You could say that. By nature, men are born with strong Yang energy and women are born with strong Yin energy. The Ghost Yin technique was created to overcome this. Swish. The Shadow Master extended his hand. Then a damp and chilly energy rose from his hand. Whoosh. His true energy was on a different level compared to ordinary martial artists. Once one mastered the Ghost Yin technique, the wounded area would freeze coldly, allowing them to inflict fatal injuries on the opponent. The Shadow Master demonstrated the Yin energy of the Ghost Yin technique and said, "To control Yin energy with a man's body, unfortunately, there is no other way than castration. Otherwise, it may clash with the Yang energy generated within the body, causing one to lose their mind." I see. I'm not forcing you, so you don't need to feel burdened. To possess this kind of Yin energy, there is too much to lose. Is it okay to have something even more Yin? Even more Yin? What do you? Whoosh. Before he could finish his words, the Shadow Master suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body, and a chill ran down his spine. The energy suddenly erupting from Mok Jung-un. It went beyond being Yin and was spreading a dreadful death energy that could only be felt from dead corpses. Well, you have a remarkable talent for surprises. Chapter 125, Shadow Clan 2. Well, you have a remarkable talent for surprises. Whoosh. The energy suddenly erupting from Mok Jung-un. It went beyond being Yin and was closer to a dreadful death energy that could only be felt from the dead. What in the world is this? The Shadow Master couldn't hide his astonishment at the eerie energy that stimulated not only the five senses but even the sixth sense. He had also accumulated Yin energy through the ghosting technique for many years, but it was incomparably colder and more Yin compared to that. Is this enough? Mok Jung-un inwardly thought at the Shadow Master's reaction. That was because the death energy Mok Jung-un was showing now wasn't in its complete form but adjusted to a level that living people could feel. The complete energy of death was an energy that only the deceased or the two demonic beauties could sense. Humph. You must have really hated the idea of castration. Well, Mok Jung-un shrugged his shoulders slightly at Chong Ryong's sneer. What he needed right now was the position of the Shadow Master's disciple and successor. If he only needed the title of a subordinate, he should have entered under an executive of the Five Kings level, not the Shadow Master. Swish. Mok Jung-un concealed the energy he had revealed. This was also quite tricky to control, contrary to how it looked. He had to reveal the death energy at a subtle level as if from the peak realm. Is this enough? Mok Jung-un asked the Shadow Master. Then the Shadow Master, who had been amazed by Mok Jung-un's death energy, opened his mouth. I've seen many talented individuals, but you're the first of your kind. An energy more Yin than what can be cultivated through the Ghost Yin technique. It was a rare occurrence. There weren't many ways for a man's body to cultivate Yin energy. Most of them could be said to be extreme or fatal for a man's body. Even if he found someone born with Yin energy, they had incurable diseases like the 9 Yin severed meridians. 1. And had extremely short lifespans. Perhaps that was why the Shadow Master asked with curiosity, "How did you cultivate this energy?" At this question, Mok Jung-un pondered for a moment. Then he followed Chong Ryong's advice ringing in his ears. To be honest, I don't know. Every time I cultivated my internal energy, Yin energy accumulated within my body. It might be because of my constitution. Constitution? Yes. At those words, the Shadow Master's eyes narrowed. May I examine your body for a moment? The Shadow Master wanted to examine Mok Jiongun's body just in case. It was hard to believe that a man's body could possess such tremendous yin energy without castration. At his words, Mok Jiongun readily extended his hand. The Shadow Master placed his fingers on the blood vessels of Mok Jiongun's wrist. Swish. And he injected his own yin energy. The yin energy that entered through the Shadow Master's fingers flowed into Mok Jiongun's body along his blood vessels. Control. Mok Jiongun focused his mind and adjusted the death energy. Although there was no way the Shadow Master could read the energy of death, it was in case his internal energy had a yin tendency. Will it disperse? If it was yang internal energy, it would disperse when it collided with Mok Jiongun's death energy. This was a concerning part, but Mok Jiongun didn't mind. He could make away one way or another. Swish. At that moment, the Shadow Master removed his fingers from Mok Jiongun's pulse. Then with a highly satisfied face he said, curling his lips, "Contrary to my concerns, your blood vessels are strong and your internal organs are healthy." What the Shadow Master was concerned about was Mok Jiongun's physical condition. If the state of his body was poor or unbalanced due to the yin energy that exceeded expectations, it would be meaningless even if he learned it. To have such luck. Naturally, the Shadow Master couldn't help but feel excited. Even if they were castrated at a very young age, a rebellious spirit would arise, so he thought Mok Jiongun at the age of 17 wouldn't accept it. That's why he thought it would be difficult to have a true disciple. However, if he had this innate yin energy, it seemed he could circulate the techniques of the Ghosting Technique, Flying Ghost Blade Technique and Ghost Shadow Claw Technique. And if done well, if he accepted Mok Jiongun as a disciple and examined his body, he might be able to create a secret method to stabilize yin energy without castration. It was truly a joyful day to have such luck come in bundles. However, the Shadow Master didn't reveal this and said, "What a coincidence. I didn't expect this, but it seems you coming to me is good luck. Then will you accept me as your disciple?" Of course. Even if it weren't for that, depending on the situation, I would have accepted you as a quasi-disciple. Knock knock. Before the Shadow Master could finish his words, someone urgently knocked on the door of the indoor training room. At this, the Shadow Master approached the iron door of the training room and knocked in the same way, making a thumping sound. The only difference was that he knocked only once. Thud. Then, creak. The iron door of the training room opened and a middle-aged man with a mustache entered. Society leader. External Affairs Director Yun. What is it? At his question, the middle-aged man called External Affairs Director Yun, aware of Mok Jiongun's presence, tried to report by whispering in his ear. Then the Shadow Master shook his head and said, "You don't have to be so conscious. From this moment, that child has become my disciple." Disciple. At those words, External Affairs Director Yun's eyes widened. You don't mean a quasi-disciple, but... Yes. An official disciple. Then the External Affairs Director knelt on one knee and clasped his hands together, shouting to the Shadow Master, "Society leader. Congratulations on accepting a disciple." Oh ho ho. The Shadow Master waved his hands and expressed his joy. Seeing them, Mok Jiongun slightly tilted his head. It was hard to understand what a quasi-disciple was and what an official disciple meant. Judging by the murmuring of the warriors guarding the door of the indoor training room, it seemed to be a topic of discussion. At that moment, External Affairs Director Yun also clasped his hands together and greeted Mok Jiongun. External Affairs Director Yun Beck greets the society leader's official disciple. "I am Mok Jiongun." Caught off guard, Mok Jiongun also clasped his hands together, bowed his head and accepted the greeting. It felt exaggerated, but was this really such a big deal? As he was thinking that, External Affairs Director Yun said, unable to hide his excitement, "I sincerely admire young master's determination. I fully understand the difficult decision you made as a man." Huh. At his words, Mok Jiongun frowned. What was he talking about now? Did he think he became a disciple because he agreed to be castrated? Chong Ryong laughed like crazy as if she was holding her stomach. Even Mok Jiongun, who had no emotional response to this matter, found it absurd enough to let out a small chuckle. However, Mok Jiongun didn't need to clarify this. Oh ho ho. I think I caused a misunderstanding. This child won't be castrated. What? At his words, External Affairs Director Yun showed an incomprehensible expression. He had served the Shadow Master for a long time, so he knew better than anyone that castration was essential to learn his unique martial arts. But if he wasn't going to be castrated, why was he a true disciple? To the puzzled man, the Shadow Master said with a smile. Should I say he was born with Yin energy? Yin energy? At the Shadow Master's words, External Affairs Director Yun unknowingly looked at Mok Jiongun. Then, discovering something, he said in a surprised voice. Society leader. That sword, could it be? The reason for his astonishment was the evil commandment sword hanging from Mok Jiongun's waist. As the one who served the Shadow Master, he naturally knew about that sword. I gave the sword to this child. The sword? Yes. But that sword is... External Affairs Director Yun swallowed his words, unable to finish his sentence. That sword was deemed too dangerous and uncontrollable, so he had entrusted it to a monk he was acquainted with to seal its demonic energy. It was fortunate that I had to go to Corpse Blood Valley for the observation anyway. That Taoist was Yun He Paiyong, the third disciple of Nsioke, the leader of the Primal Killing Pavilion in charge of Corpse Blood Valley. I'm not sure if this will be all right. External Affairs Director Yun looked at the evil commandment sword with worried eyes. That sword was a demon sword. Including the Shadow Master himself, his subordinates, and even those who had learned martial arts from him couldn't control that sword. But was it okay to give that to a newly accepted disciple? To the concerned External Affairs Director Yun, the Shadow Master said understandingly, "You don't have to worry. The sword has chosen this child as its master." What? Is that true? Would I ever lie to the External Affairs Director? Oh ho ho. Oh my. At these words, External Affairs Director Yun alternately looked at Mok Jiongun and the evil commandment sword in amazement. There was no way the Shadow Master would lie about this. If this was true, it couldn't be anything but a coincidence. It had only been 6 days since the evil commandment sword came into the Shadow Master's possession. And that sword was going into the hands of the first disciple he gained from participating in the Corpse Blood Valley's closing ceremony. Is it fate? There was no other way to see it. Or should he say that the young master was blessed with heavenly fortune? If it couldn't be controlled, it might be called a demon sword, but if it had chosen its master, it could be said to be the greatest famous sword made by the master craftsman Oyezi. However, I'm not sure if it will be all right. There was someone who directly obtained that sword under the Shadow Master's orders and desired it more than anyone. He was worried that it might lead to trouble if that person found out. Moreover, since this young master had become an official disciple, he might show strong opposition, thinking that the rolling stone had pushed out the embedded stone. I hope there won't be any problems. Although he was worried, he couldn't foresee the future for now. More importantly, there was a more urgent matter at hand. Society leader, I think you should go to the sect hall right away. What's the matter? Urgent news has arrived from 19 Yulmyong. At External Affairs Director Yun's words, the Shadow Master, who had been smiling, frowned. 19 Yulmyong? The Imperial Palace, too? The basis of intelligence was the code. All transmissions were conveyed in code, but the Shadow Master had memorized them all, so he could accurately know the location just by hearing words associated with the heavenly stems, earthly branches, and the 5 elements. External Affairs Director Yun glanced at Mok Jiongun once and said in a small voice, "It seems they have found it. The underground golden prison has the plum blossom." Shoo! Suddenly, the Shadow Master interrupted his report. He had judged that since he had become an official disciple, he should learn about the affairs of the Shadow Clan, so it was fine for him to hear, but this was an exception. Let's talk about that at the clan main hall. I understand. As the External Affairs Director answered, the Shadow Master turned his head and asked Mok Jiongun for understanding. Will you wait here? I'll be back soon. It would be good if you memorize this in advance. The Shadow Master took something out of his bosom and handed it to him. It was a scroll rolled up, and on the outside it was written, Ghost Shadow Claw Technique. It was the secret manual of the Ghost Shadow Claw Technique, one of the Shadow Master's unique martial arts. Receiving it, Mok Jiongun bowed his head and replied, I understand. Then I'll be back soon. With those words, The Shadow Master left the indoor training room with the External Affairs Director. After they left and closed the iron door, Mok Jae-eun recalled the report External Affairs Director Yun had made earlier. Plum Blossom. What was that? What did they find? Does Plum Blossom mean bowing to fire? It seemed to be cut off in the middle, so this wasn't all. What kind of matter was it that they maintained strict security even from him, who had become an official disciple? Well, he thought he would soon find out even if he wasn't impatient. Swish. Mok Jae-eun unrolled the scroll the Shadow Master had given him. Since he said he would be back soon, it seemed he could pass the time by looking at the secret manual of the Ghost Shadow Claw technique. However, it didn't take long. Mok Jae-eun, who had scanned through it in one go, nodded his head. It's quite an interesting claw technique. There were energy circulation methods and detailed postures, so he grasped it instantly. At this, Chong Ryong clicked her tongue. I don't know about the rest, but I envy that extraordinary brain of yours, mortal. Is that so? Mok Jae-eun had been like this since he was young, so it wasn't particularly special to him. Rather, if this was the original, he thought about entering the mental realm to see how the techniques were executed. He had been told to memorize it, but there should be no problem if he learned it first. With that thought, Mok Jae-eun entered the mental realm while reading the secret manual. It hadn't even been half a quarter of an hour. Bang! At that moment, the iron door of the indoor training room opened with a rough bang. Huh! Mok Jae-eun, who had almost finished the mental training, opened his eyes. Turning his head towards the entrance, he saw two boys who seemed to be around 18 or 19 years old, the same age as Mok Jae-eun, and a young man who appeared to be in his mid-20s. The young man with quite a sharp impression had a red, angry face for some reason. The young man who entered looked Mok Jae-eun up and down, then discovered the evil commandment sword at his waist and gritted his teeth. Crunch. To him, one of the boys with a particularly prominent chin said as if it was absurd. How could this happen? Didn't senior brother risk his life to obtain the evil commandment sword? Junior brother is right. That sword should be received by senior brother. But how could they give it to a hostage from the righteous faction? I can't stand this. Brothers, I'll take it back right now. With those words, the boy with the prominent chin kicked off the ground and launched his body towards Mok Jae-eun. Whoosh. Seeing the boy suddenly attacking, Mok Jae-eun tilted his head, then, smack. Huh. With one hand, he lightly blocked the trajectory of the claw technique the boy was executing and grabbed his neck with lightning-fast hand movements. Clench. Kook. Suppressed in an instant without being able to properly execute a single technique, the boy couldn't hide his momentary bewilderment. Looking at the boy, Mok Jae-eun said in a dry voice, "You're risking your life at our first meeting."